Thank you, Mike, and thank you for having me follow one of the great figures of humanitarianism. I don't know how I keep up with that. Charles Handy, who spoke here, I think, last year, tells a story which, for me, captures this idea of transformational leadership. And Charles is Irish, and I'm Irish, so I can tell this joke, which is that he got lost in the hills south of Dublin once, and he stopped and asked somebody, how do I get to wherever it is? And he was told, well, drive down that road, and 1 mile before the red pub, turn up to the right. And I think that's our role in transformation leadership. It's how do we know when we have to turn an organisation or a sector or an issue before we get to the place we shouldn't be? And that's kind of a challenge. So let me talk about Macmillan in that context very briefly, as Mike brought it up, and then a bit about the British Council, and a bit, I think, about some of the inflections that we in the development world are seeing. When I joined Macmillan a while ago, we had a great mission statement, which was to improve the lives of everyone living with cancer. We weren't quite so clear what improve meant, and we didn't know who everyone was, but it was a great mission statement. So we did a piece of work, and actually that piece of work changed everything, because what it told us was that there were 2 million people in the UK who had cancer at any given point in time. But it also told us that that number was going to be 4 million in 2020. Now, what that said was that we couldn't just go on the way we were going. Doing more of what we did last year was not going to do it. We had to find a way of turning right off the road before we got to the red pub and the world ended. And that really set the strategy of the organisation. Everything at the end of the day came back to understanding that number, believing that number, and understanding what it meant for Hampshire as opposed to Scotland, as opposed to anywhere else. It also changed how we saw ourselves, because we were relatively large for a charity, roughly 100 million, but the country spent 7 billion on cancer and another 120 billion on healthcare. And what we realised was there, if you can imagine a kind of a little green pea and then a tennis ball and then this large, enormous thing being health spend in the UK, there was no point being a slightly bigger green pea. What we needed to do was to shape everything else, because that was how we were going to improve the lives of 2 million people and then 4 million people going forward. And the way to do that was to tell those stories, to be incredibly consistent, to make sure that every time somebody went fundraising, that message was consistent with the press release that went out yesterday and what somebody was saying to an MP in the morning. So for me, transformational leadership was trying to get the whole organisation aligned behind one cause, one mission, and being ruthless in a nice way in delivering that. So let me think about the British Council in the same kind of way. Many of you will be familiar with the British Council. We've got roughly 12,000 people in 150 countries around the world. Roughly a fifth of what we do you'd call development. Much of it isn't. We teach a lot of English. We run a lot of exams. We work in countries which don't qualify for ODA. But some of it does, and picking up on some of the work we're doing in Syria, we're working with young people who we've been working with from roughly about 2010 now, from across the whole of Syria, and saying, what do you need so that the day that peace arrives, that you will be in a position to lead change in the country, be it in the community, be it in the town, be it at national level. And my favourite quote was one of the young people who went through the training we'd been giving them, who had driven in from Aleppo to see us in Beirut, was saying, well, one day, this line through the middle of Aleppo will go, and people on our side who've been firing things at them, and people on their side who've been firing things on us, they're our cousins, they're our brothers. One day we'll have to get on. So the skills that we need are ones which will allow us to have mediation, not recrimination. And I remember that soundbite. I thought it was incredibly powerful. So the kinds of things that we do as the British Council are really focusing on leadership development, capability development, capacity development. Now, we do it because of our history, and we do it because we believe that at the end of the day, it's relationships between people which will drive the positive change. For those of you who know us well, you'll know that we were set up in the 30s and got separated out from the Foreign Office in 1940 because we were set up to counter fascism. We were set up to counter propaganda. We were set up to counter attacks on values I suspect most of us in this room would hold dear. And what they said at the time was that the role of the prudent state was to foster the interchange of knowledge, of ideas and discoveries. And the reason you do that is because that's what drives a basis of friendly knowledge and understanding between people. And that concept, which was true in the 1940s, was true in Northern Ireland. What reduced the level of violence in Northern Ireland was the police and the military and the intelligence services. What brought peace was that basis of friendly knowledge and understanding between people. It was the women's movement. It was punk rock. Punk was the music which could transcend communities. It wasn't, something which was associated with one rather than the other. And that's the role, I think, that we all need to bear in mind as we're out doing what we're doing, building those relationships, creating that understanding between individuals, between us, between you and your organisations and the partners that you work with. In doing that, it's the transmission of values and the transmission of understanding as much as the blanket, the bottle of water, the tent, the school, whatever it is, which will drive the positive change. But I do think we are at a point of inflection, and if I can, maybe outline three challenges that we see. The first one is whatever this thing called, whatever's behind Brexit, behind, alternative facts, whatever that thing is challenging some of the things that we understand. So it's not only making sure that we understand what's happening out there so we can make a case to support people in Yemen or Syria or the DRC. It's also making sure we understand what's happening in our own societies because things have changed. We know that for many young people, they're very much internationalist, but there's a very large minority who are not. So what are we doing about making sure that the understanding that we take for granted, which drives the support we all have for the development agenda, is continued into the next generation, because I'm not sure we should be taking it for granted. Linked to that is some of what's being said about the 0.7% and whether it's being spent on the right things or the wrong things or whether it should be spent at all. The analogy for me is fundraising. Now, most organisations here, I suspect, will fundraise in one way or another. And we have to remember, and I think the fundraisers in the room will recognise that every act of fundraising is a transaction. Even if you're receiving money, and even if somebody signs on the dotted line and gives you the £2 a month, you are giving them something. You are giving them, maybe it's a good feeling, maybe it's a place in the London Marathon, maybe it's a nice evening out at the annual ball, but you are giving them something. So as we ask the taxpayer to give us £10 billion a year, we need to make sure we're clear about what we are giving back to them. Now, some of that is in telling the stories of the impact that we all have. Some of it is saying, actually, this really is in the interests of the UK. A stable and prosperous Syria into the future is in our interest, because we all know these other things we worry about migration crises or whatever, is caused by instability. So let me tell you about what we are doing and how ultimately that will help what you worry about, pressure on public services in the European continent. The other point of inflection for me is, which I don't think we've quite woken up to, is the implications of the Sustainable Development Goals as opposed to the Millennium Goals. I think it changes quite a lot. The easy one for me is in education, where the Millennium Goals would be focusing on access to primary education, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals are saying you need an education system, you need to worry about the right amount of higher education, you need to worry about 21st century skills, coding. How are we going to get coding into some of these economies? And we need to practice what we preach, because one of the things I worry about is that when we talk about development within Europe in particular, we apply approaches that we don't accept as legitimate in the rest of the world. So, for example, Hull City of Culture. The major goal of that is to help regenerate aspects of Hull as an economy, as in a city. We are taking a cultural approach to that. We are seeing the creative industries, we're seeing art, we're seeing sport as being legitimate ways of doing that. So I worry when I don't see us taking the same kind of approach to some of the development challenges that we see in some of the major conurbations in the developing world. So I think as a development community, I think we do need to think about the Charles Handy proposition. What are those things which could happen, which means we have to turn off the road? Because if we don't, and if we don't maybe connect in a slightly different way to the next generation of young people here in the UK, if we don't explain the benefit of what we're doing, not only for humanity and not only because it's the right thing to do, because actually this is good for us all in the long run. And if we don't say, actually, there's some different approaches, which was the whole purpose behind the Sustainable Development Goals, was saying it applies to us too, but some of the tools that we apply to us, maybe we should be exporting those as well. And if I can just finish maybe by just saying one other thing, which, Jan's numbers, of course, are deeply worrying, but one of my favourite websites is one which a young academic called Max Rosen has, called Our World in Data. And he's one presentation up there at the moment, which is The World as 100 People, and looking back in history at the grand sweep. And we must remember that while things are difficult, the contribution that organisations like yours have made to the world are tremendous, because we've never been more literate, we've never been, on average, God forbid what may happen in the future, less hungry, and we've never been more literate. So thank you for the time to talk to you. Congratulations on what you do, but beware the red pub down the road.